All right, welcome to 10 a.m. Pacific time in track 2 with Chris Spehn, hunting for Windows features, that's in quotes, and how to use them. Chris is a member of the X-Force Red adversary simulation team at IBM. He's worked on diverse projects for public and private sector clients, assurance around the security posture of their products and infrastructure. He's done pen testing, offense and defense, started with Discover, some time in finance, security researcher for TrustWave Spiderwebs. He's been all over the place. Today, he's here to talk to us about how to find features in Windows that we might want to abuse, is what it sounds like. Chris, thank you.
All right, just making sure everyone can hear me. Yeah, cool. So yeah, welcome to Hunting for Windows Features and How to Use Them. It was June 2019. I was in a taxi in Bangalore, India, heading to a client to give them some red team training, working for Mandiant at the time. Once I got to the client and had done the first session with them, I got an emergency message in a chat channel about a client that I was doing a red team for. Basically emergency meeting. And I was like, I can't do it until 8 p.m. tonight. It's a 2-hour travel back and forth. So gave a training all day, came back, and then I had this client meeting. And so bit of a story here where the client said, I expected you to use the 0-day to bypass our EDR product. And I was just like, you can't be serious right now, right? Like, how am I going to do this at all, right? Like this is literally impossible what you're asking me to do. When I got back to Denver, Colorado, where I'm based out of, laying in bed, my other half is like, what's wrong, you know? And I'm like, oh, well, I just had a rough client meeting, you know, and I'm trying to think about this problem I'm solving. So this was literally this of like, you know, why are you shutting me out? And I was doing nothing but thinking about like, how could I actually use a 0-day on a red team engagement from start to finish? So eventually I had this epiphany, like it's a feature, not a bug, right? Like classic Microsoft and other vendors. And so eventually I decided that this was possible and you could do it. And if we had a little automation, it would help a lot to expedite that process and instead of spending a lot of research and development time trying to make it happen. So a little bit about myself. This is a quote that I throw on like every presentation slide. It really represents my viewpoint at this point in time in life. But really, I'm a red teamer. Done some different open source stuff. Great Scott, Gotta Catch 'Em All. It's an open source, essentially lawbin tool. I'm also part of the LawBass project, Living Off the Land Binary and Scripts. The site you see in the screenshot, I created it. And then Windows Feature Hunter, which we're talking about today. So I'll give you a little more background about myself. This fine gentleman did a good job. Worked for Discover as my first security job, doing pen testing and a little bit of IR. Was a security researcher at TrustWave Spiderwebs. Did some contracting with MasterCard. Worked at the grocery store called Schnucks in St. Louis area. If anyone's ever heard of it, I'll be amazed. Come talk to me after the talk. You've heard of it? Schnucks. Yeah. So I was the senior technical lead of threat and vulnerability management, reports to the CISO there. And then eventually I landed at Mandiant. That was my most previous role. Was there about 4.5 years and a principal consultant. And now I'm on the X-Force Red adversarial simulation team where I do 2 to 6 month long red teams and focus on self and all of that. So we'll talk a little about Windows features. Primarily what we're going to focus on is DLL sideloading. So this is the MITRE text. There's a little more in the MITRE ATT&CK page. It's MITRE T1574.002, and I'm sure everyone else has that memorized, right? I always have to look it up. But basically, it's taking advantage of search order in order to load a DLL. And why this is advantageous to us is reputation. Reputation is everything when we're trying to get a beacon or execute our malware, right? And so if we can use something like MS Paint to load our malware versus an unsigned brand new executable that we have, it's a lot better than just having something with no reputation. So that's kind of the idea behind it. This is kind of Microsoft's stance on DLL sideloading. They wrote this blog post about triaging one of these. And they basically say it's a feature, not a bug. This is a quote from that blog post. It's actually a fantastic blog post from them. But it's kind of insane that they think, this is the way things should work. So they talk about DLL search order a lot, and this is the order that it goes in, where it's the directory from which the application is loaded. And that's primarily what I want everyone to understand and focus on today. We'll be doing some live demos and identifying DLL sideloading live, and then a bit of a story about an engagement I did recently where I successfully did use a 0-day on an engagement, technically speaking, as long as F5 considers it a vulnerability. So you're really at the mercy of vendors for DLL sideloading, and if they will fix it or not. And if they don't fix it, then I'll just keep using it, right, on red teams. So there is search order is quite tricky. However, generally speaking, this is kind of what DLL sideloading looks like, where that current directory that we're executing it from, we have MS Paint and then msft-edit.dll, and we're seeing a message box pop here. So due to search order, it loads our unsigned DLL with MS Paint, and this is just a message box, but you can really do whatever you want, in the code. So now we'll go into a bit of developer usage, and basically it's a feature and not a bug. So we'll go over that. There's really 2 API calls that you have to pay attention to, and we'll look at essentially how a developer would introduce this feature, because it's not a vulnerability, right? So we have load library demo exe.c. Basically, we have our DLL main or win main function. Oh.
We're not seeing it.
I am, yeah. I can unplug and replug.
You were good until you.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I'm not mirroring. My bad. That'll be, give me 1 second to fix this. Apologies. But essentially what we're going to go over is how a developer would potentially introduce this sort of feature, right? All right, cool. We're back. Hopefully that's the only demo fail that we'll have is video problems, but we'll see. So essentially, when we have an executable like this, we'll have our win main function, our main function within the program. And essentially what happens is a developer calls load library on a DLL. And so there are optional parameters for this where you can limit search order and say only load this from system32. And that would be the proper way to implement this as a developer if you were writing a program. And so then after that, we have get proc address, which is really just the export in the DLL. So if we were to go over to DLL export sideload, we see we have this export of demo here and just popping a message box, and we can see inside of DLL main as well. So I already have this compiled, and we could compile it, but basically we'll just run dev.exe here. And then we're going to see this where DLL main is called, like we just saw in the code, popping that message box. And then we have demo export called. So in general, this is what we're looking for. If we have just load library and no get proc address after it in a binary like MS Paint, which we'll see in another demo, then just load library means just DLL main. That's the only place you're going to be able to execute code from, and you need to structure your DLL accordingly. If there's an export, that's better. Because of loader lock within DLL main, there are limitations of what code you can and can't execute within DLL main. So if you find one that loads an export, which is that get proc address, that will be the name of the export. It's much better and less complex to get your shellcode to execute. So that's just something to keep in mind. And basically, you find out it's a feature and not a bug. So now we'll go through the process of manually identifying DLL sideloading within MS Paint. And I like using MS Paint as an example, just because I think it's hilarious that you can use it to execute malware, right? So just give me 1 second. And we'll go ahead and open up MS Paint in a program called API Monitor. What API Monitor does is really just instruments so that we can see the different Windows API calls that are happening, right? So I guarantee you everyone in this room can identify this, and I have a DLL there. So we saw it load. I should probably delete that and redo it, but that's okay. So it finished executing. We're just going to go to modules, and my resolution is not great here. So just give me a second to actually find mspaint.exe. I'm assuming you guys are seeing the same thing as me with it being kind of jumbled. That's okay. We'll just go to here. Usually it's a little easier to actually go into mspaint.exe versus another DLL because there's going to be a lot of other stuff happening related to Windows internals. And on the side, you can see there's API filter, which basically I just checked all the boxes. So if you don't know what you're doing, you just download API Monitor, you check all these boxes, and you're going to start. It's going to instrument every single different Windows API call that it has definitions for, essentially. So if we search for load library, we're going to see a lot of this because I'm not actually within the MS Paint thread. Oh, I accidentally just clicked on it and found the thread for it. So essentially, we do load library. We see this GDI plus, and then we see msft edit.dll, right? So we don't see any git proc address. So that means we can only execute code within DLL main with the DLL name msft edit.dll in the same directory as MS Paint. So we do have a DLL here and the same directory, and I'll show you the code behind it. You can see DLL main side load. We're similar. This is literally a definition. This bool win API DLL main. This is straight from MSDN, straight from Microsoft, and then we just add in a message box here. So if we run MS Paint, we should see DLL main side load successful. And this could be a double click. You don't have to do this from command line. So generally speaking, when we're doing this on engagements, we either package this in like an encrypted zip or within an ISO file, and then it would be 2 user double clicks to get our beacon or get our malware executed on the system. This is making sense to everyone so far? Are we all on the same page?
So it's a name DLL that MS Paint's already looking for, and you're just modifying that?
Correct. It's looking for msft edit.dll. And I'll show you msft edit.dll is actually in system 32. And so if we go back to our slides where Microsoft talks about DLL search order and how that happens, it searches for that DLL in the current directory first. Now, like I said before, there are optional parameters for load library where you can limit to only search in system 32 and change the way it's going to do search order, essentially. So it's very important if you are doing Windows development and creating executables and you sign it by your company to limit this search order if you're using some native API call from Microsoft. So hopefully that makes sense and that answered your question. Like I said, my talk is mostly live demos of just kind of explaining and making sure we're all on the same page and we all understand this and raising awareness about this topic. Because really the only effective preventative measure for this would be doing application control or application allow listing and only allowing signed DLLs on your system, which is a lot easier said than done. I've seen it twice in my 10 years of doing pen testing and red teaming. Yes, sir.
Okay, so won't the AI or AV catch this?
No, not at all, because MS Paint, it is signed, it's reputable. It's been around for so many years. I don't even know when MS Paint was written, but I started using Windows in like Windows 3.1 and MS Paint existed back then, right?
No, but if it's trying to load a DLL not in system 32, won't it then
shouldn't it detect that? Yeah. So it depends on where you're doing it from, right? I would say if you're just like doing it out of the downloads folder, maybe it might detect it pending the AV or EDR product. There are certain ones. I don't want to name names or have any affiliation with a specific EDR. I'm agnostic as a consultant, but we'll go over DLL sideloading detections as well. There's a blog post from John Dwyer from the X-Force Red or X-Force Blue or IR side. And he did a kind of a sister or brother blog post to mine where he wrote a PowerShell script that would detect DLL sideloading or forensically identify it, right? This happened even if you deleted the DLL in the exe, it still does it. And the tricky part about the detection side here is DLLs actually aren't stored in shim cache. So you have to parse the MFT to actually get all of the information that you would want if you were doing an instant response investigation and performing forensics on a machine and trying to identify how the malware was executed. And maybe you have some other information that tips you to that, right? But if you were just looking in general and wanted to run it, then you may get a few false positives. But generally the idea is looking for, excuse me, is looking for a binary from system 32 or a DLL from system 32 that executed or loaded outside of system 32, right? So you'd think it would be like this really easy detection and, the AI and the machine learning would be privy to it. But there are other scenarios where that's not successful, right? You could have a vendor binary that's loading a vendor DLL and not loading a Windows DLL that originates from system 32. And then we're in this really tricky spot where that might actually regularly execute out of app data as well. And we're doing something very, very normal there. And even if they're doing like cloud machine learning and all of that and pulling all this data, that's going to be a very normal behavior. So the whole idea here, if you use it effectively, you're kind of the needle in the haystack where people aren't, it's going to be very difficult to detect in certain scenarios, especially vendor signed binaries with vendor DLLs. Maybe you identify, a certain VPN in usage and you download that endpoint inspection agent and you find a 0-day, which we're going to do later, right? In this case, it's not the best scenario, like I was talking about with a vendor DLL as well. It is something that loads from system 32, so that detection logic would work successfully. So hopefully that answers your question as well.
But did you say like application like this, App Locker as an example, you had App Locker turned on and you were only allowing the DLLs that you approved and stuff? Correct, yeah. Yeah, if you limited it to signed DLLs, which is actually what happened on this engagement of like, I found a 0-day and then it didn't work. So it sounds like it's a nice full story of like coming together. But in this particular scenario, it was blocked because of that. And it really funnels tradecraft into lol bins. And you have a very limited set of lol bins that you can use in that type of scenario. I would say a lot of lateral movement, things like that rely on DLLs. Any other questions before we move on to the automated version of that? Okay, cool. So yeah, we did identify DLL side loading in MS Paint. And so I was like, well, what if there's a way to automate this? So I worked with someone in the audience, Ruben from our team, Fuzzy Sec on Twitter. He helped me write a tool that uses Frida, which is generally like, how many people have heard of Frida before? Okay, good amount. So generally you're probably familiar with Frida for like mobile application testing, right? Well, it's not just limited to that. You can use it for Windows things like this to instrument API calls like you would in mobile app testing to bypass cert pinning or something similar to that nature, right? That's kind of like the classic example where Frida would get introduced. However, you can use it on Windows as well. So this is Windows Feature Hunter. It's not limited to just DLL side loading. And please let me know if the text is not big enough. I can make it bigger. But
let's go ahead and copy MS Paint. So we'll use the same example. And then we'll go ahead and there's a help menu and wiki and stuff as well. But basically we're just gonna give it our target, which will just be MS Paint in the same directory. And the mode will be DLL. Oh, sure, absolutely. All right, me making it bigger kind of fumbled some things there. So we'll let it run through again so everyone can see virtually as well. But right now it's essentially just running MS Paint. It's doing the same thing that API monitor is doing. It's looking for these load library calls. And so here we get the raw log. It also writes a CSV that you can open up and go look at it. So if you wanted to run it against like all of System 32 or every like Microsoft signed binary or vendor signed binary against it, it does scale like that as well. So here you see two different calls and it's basically telling you this is potentially DLL main sideloading, which obviously we already know because we identified it manually, but it really limits the amount of time that we have to spend on these things, especially say, if you find some like AWS bucket and there's all of these binaries at a client and you have hundreds of binaries, doing that manually is quite tedious, right? It was probably later in 2019, you know, I was obsessing over like, how would I use a 0 day? I literally opened every single binary in System 32 and API monitor, right? Pretty painful. It took me days, right, to go through, and I was recording each one. So whenever I came over to the AppSim team, I worked with Ruben to have an automated solution for this, where we could, you know, identify these rapidly and, you know, use 0 days on engagements. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Just the automated version of it, where, you know, spent a lot of time doing it. And so now we'll go over detecting DLL sideloading. I know I touched on this briefly. But the gentleman over here, you know, asked a great question about it with antivirus and EDR, and, you know, won't the AI or learning the machines catch it, right? And the answer really, it just depends, right? So in the case of like MS Paint, the example that we've been using, if we executed that out of like our downloads folder, then 100% like that will probably be detected by certain EDRs. I know which ones it will be detected by. But again, I don't want to name names in terms of EDR vendors while I'm being recorded. So if you come talk to me after the talk, I'll tell you which ones are pretty good at detecting DLL sideloadings and which ones aren't. But essentially, that's the idea. If a binary from System 32 or a DLL from System 32 executes or loads outside of System 32, it's probably bad, but there are exceptions to it, right? Just like everything else. You really have to baseline everything. And that's where it gets really tricky, like especially in like program files directories, it gets really complicated to actually detect that reliably. So we're going to use John Dwyer's tool, and I will stay in this terminal so everyone can still see it. But basically he has a PowerShell script that he released, and we're just going to point it at that WFH directory that we just executed MS Paint out of. Actually, we'll point it at WWHF, and we should see that MS Paint execution and potentially the whole developer usage demo as well. So it's collecting all these userland DLLs, basically comparing and seeing like, did a DLL from System 32 execute outside or get loaded outside of System 32? So it creates a folder and writes multiple CSV files. And so if we open this up, we should see MS Paint with MSFT edit in it. Just expand these out. And so we can see the location as well as the sideload the hash and if it's signed or not, right? And so this helps drill down a little more. Like if it were the real MSFT edit, it's going to be signed by Microsoft, right? Where in this case, like we just created this DLL and it loads it arbitrarily. It doesn't care about reputation in terms of DLLs. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. detecting DLL sideloading is very difficult, right? As I mentioned, it really just depends on the scenario and how you're using it. And so hopefully I've conveyed how you can use it effectively. So for example, like finding a vendor binary that loads a vendor DLL that is also signed is your best scenario, where if you want to evade detections, it's going to be quite difficult, especially I would say there's a treasure trove of them in app data directories, local or roaming. And if you run WFH against those, you'll find a lot of different side loads. But in particular, if you can find side loads that libraries that are written by the vendor themselves, that's the best way you can use DLL sideloading, really, because it's going to be even trickier for EDR vendors and machine learning and all of that. And like you may see in the machine learning model within the EDR interface that the global prevalence of this executable is very high, right? So it has a lot of reputation. That's what we want. We're just trying to use something reputable to load our malware. So now we are going to find one live. But we're just going to do it in the real world example. I could show you another one from like System 32 or something of that nature, but I think the real world example really sells it a little more. So essentially I was doing a 2 to 3 month long red team recently, and we were in the recon phase. So we were doing a bunch of passive reconnaissance, and then eventually active. We had, their IP spaces. We had done DNS recon, and we started taking screenshots of all of the sites that were out there, and some of them browsing, some of them found the client's VPN portal, and it was F5 VPN. And immediately I'm prompted to download the endpoint inspection agent. I was like, oh, cool. This is exactly what I want. And so it was a cab file that contained many different cab files, and I extracted every different exe out of it and ran WFH against it. And to my surprise, there was nothing, right? And turns out there was a bug in WFH where I wasn't accounting. Ruben and I discussed this. It's quite tricky. We learned a few things about how they're doing things, but basically wasn't hooking enough of the load library calls, because there's many different versions of them. Some of them are for Unicode and things like that. There's like EX, EXW, EXA, so on and so forth. And there is like a source of truth to that. Yeah, it was a miss on my part, but I was like, maybe the automation isn't working. So I did open each one in API monitor, just like I showed with MS Paint, and eventually did find a sideload in it that I will demonstrate to you guys live. I have fixed WFH to identify these in the future. So I think originally when I ran WFH against System 32, it was around like 90 something results. It's a little over 100 now. And then not to tease, but later this year, I'll be releasing what I call the DryDex version of WFH, which jumps that number to around 960 out of System 32, just by borrowing a trick from them. So let me go ahead and go into the WFH directory, and then we'll copy over. Sorry, I'm not used to using this keyboard. We'll copy F5 inst over, and I will go ahead and show you that it is signed by F5. Just so you guys know, I'm not like trying to bamboozle you or something. If we go to digital signatures, we'll see maybe get authenticate signatures better. So you can see that it is signed. If we actually look at the signer of this, it is signed by F5. But I guess for the sake of time, I won't expand all the options for get authenticate signature. And it's hard to see in the Explorer GUI, but it is signed by F5. F5 Networks Inc. And you can see it right here, right? So it was signed in 2021, very fresh, very new. I don't think it's the latest version of this binary, but it is a version of it. And if we looked at it in API Monitor, you'll see that they were actually using the, only load this DLL from system 32 feature for most of the DLLs that they're using from Microsoft. And they just had one miss. So that's all it takes, is just like one miss of not doing that properly. Maybe, it was a junior software engineer or something, and they needed to put a new feature into it, and they just did it. So again, we'll just use WFH, and we'll point it at the F5 inst binary and search for DLL side loading. So Frida is doing its thing. It's instrumenting the Windows API call, so we know if load library or get proc address is being called. And here we can see we have WTS API 32.dll that loaded out of system 32, and it called this WTS register session notification. So as we saw previously, if we go to our DLL export side load, to craft this the proper way, we'll just go ahead and do a real hacker man thing here and copy paste that over. And we'll make sure that we'll change this as well, so we know what export is called. And then we'll go ahead and craft a DLL for this quickly. So our DLL export side load, and then we need to call it WTS API 32.dll. So that's compiled now, can ls, so we'll see it. And then we'll grab that. We'll go ahead and just throw it in the WFH directory. And we'll just go into Explorer and go ahead and double click this. Actually, I know exactly why this isn't working. Does anyone have an idea of why this just didn't work? Right? Like we saw load library. We saw the export getting called. I crafted the DLL appropriately. Does anyone have any ideas of what I did wrong?
Make sure that the two items
They are in the same folder. If we go back to Explorer, you can see it's there, right? And even if we opened up API Monitor, I would show you that it attempted to load that DLL. But the reason for it is I compiled it for 64-bit because I have 64-bit MingW in my path. So I believe I do have 32-bit MingW. Could have been G++, but we're going to have to, sorry, I didn't realize what directory I was in. So we'll just go to bin, G++, and then we'll go ahead and compile that as a DLL. So it's shared, and then the DLL export side load, and then we need the name, so we'll output it to that WTS API 32.dll. And then we'll go ahead and copy that into the WFH directory. And now when we double click it, there we go, DLL main called, WTS registration session notification export called. And there we go, we just found a 0-day live if F5 would recognize it as a vulnerability. So we're at the mercy of the vendor. But you can kind of see why this is dangerous. There's DLL search order hijacking has been a known thing for a long time. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And if you're interested in it, I would highly recommend going and reading about Drydex's loader. It's super interesting the way they do it. They do it all in memory. And essentially the way that it works is they look at the import address table of these EXEs instead of instrumenting the Windows API calls like we're doing, right? And then you can those also use search order, right? So any imported DLL, you can also DLL sideload if you want. It's a lot easier said than done to automate that one, but it can be done. So right now you'd have to do like a very manual process. I think maybe there's a couple tools out there for it. I can't remember who has one at the moment, but it's not a new thing, but it's something to pay attention to, especially if you do red teaming, then go check out Drydex's loader, because they were doing some really, really cool stuff, even though they're a ransomware threat actor, and we can learn from that. So I was like, boom, I used the 0-day, and then it was blocked because they had, application control DLL allow listing where I couldn't execute unsigned DLLs, and went over to the lol bins. So really, if anyone has any questions, I'm open. There's my Discord and Twitter up there. Feel free to follow me or hit me up on Discord. Happy to collaborate and share information about this. And so I'll leave this slide up for questions. And then I do have a references slide, and I'll tweet out this deck after the talk. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you had gone through all of System 32 and found, you said 100-ish, right, instances. So have you guys kind of like built out a table of those opportunities for exploitation, or
yeah, so
kind of like the law bends, but
sure,
for this?
sure, yeah. So there is, first I'll repeat your question. Essentially the question is, do we have a table of all of the potential DLL side loads or validated DLL side loads from System 32? Yes, there is a CSV in John Dwyer's repo on the X-Force IR GitHub. There's a CSV, and it uses the current WFH results. So the one I mentioned where it's like 960, that will be the Drydex edition that I'll release later this year. It's just not quite ready yet, I would have loved to show it off here, but it's just not quite there. I've got a few more things to do with it. But there is a CSV of like 90 or so in the X-Force IR repo.
So when you load these DLLs, like, doesn't it do something kind of bad in the process? Like if it expects a real System 32 DLL or whatever, you load the fake DLL, is it gonna like not get the functionality it's expecting and crash or something? Or?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like some of them may crash, some of them may not. So the answer is, the question is, when you load these DLLs, like, aren't you going to break the functionality of the application? In some cases, yes, you will. But we don't really care about that as red teamers, right? Where we just need it to load it and execute our code. So some of them are better than others where they crash, like with MS Paint, you saw it's like, cannot create a new text document or something. There's a message box that pops up. So some of them do straight up crash, some of them don't, some of them pop message boxes. And so ideally you find one where it doesn't affect that functionality. There are other ways to do it where you can proxy those DLL exports to the real DLL. So it will continue to function as intended and execute the code that you want. Any other questions?
Primarily just replacing a portion of a function or a specific function inside the DLL. That's what you're doing.
Correct. Yeah.
But can you just add to that function?
I mean, you can execute whatever code you want inside of that exported function. So it's really just limited to your own creativity, right?
I'm just saying, could you just inject a portion in there, like leave the original function and just add
Yeah, exactly.
to it instead of completely replacing it?
Yeah, so it's similar to his question, where if you proxy the functionality to the real DLL, the app will continue to function. So you can do that and execute your code, right? So,
and I heard that you said you're going to put the slides on Twitter. You're going to put them in the Discord also.
yeah, I can do both. Yeah, absolutely. Any questions virtually or no?
Nope, nothing there.
Anyone have any other questions?
Great presentation.
All right, thank you so much.